Basically, writing tests prior to code, and you're working in little short cycles. In other words, you're not writing a whole bunch of code, whether it's a test code or production code, all at once. You're biting off little pieces, testing, writing code, testing, writing code. And that's basically what test-driven development is. The benefits of it, if you can become disciplined to adhere to it, is that you've got a suite of tests that give you constant feedback on the health of your code. Is my code working? Is it not? How many of you guys have, oh, it's an innocent little change. I'm going to make this change and I won't possibly break anything. And then you come to find out, something stopped working, right? This test-driven development with a suite of tests, you have this comfort level that I didn't do that. It's working. It's good. And that's a great feeling to have. And it actually lets you start making changes to production code much quicker, getting them ready for people and pushed into production, because you're not spending as much time tracking down that nasty bug. You know it right away when you have it. You also have documentation that stays up to date. In a waterfall world, we might crank in a bunch of documentation and stuff, and as soon as you write code, it's out of date. I mean, that's the way it is. It's out of date. Your tests now become a level of documentation, and they have to stay up to date in order to be able to run them against your code. And that's a good, at Intel, where I just retired, our developers, that's the first place they go to see how to do something is, let me go find a test for this, because it'll explain, or I can see examples of using this widget or that widget. It'll also help you drive to better design principles. Facilitates adherence to solid principles is what I have here. We could do a whole presentation just on solid principles, but in a nutshell, it's your objects have a single responsibility. You're not making them do too much. That's one example. There's an open-close principle, which basically says my object is it's closed to modification. In other words, my design should be such that I'm not modifying that object. I'm extending it in some way. That's a preferred way to do it. I won't go through every one of them. Look them up. We can do another presentation.
Quick question, going back to the previous one. You're saying that as far as the documentation goes, would look at the tests for documentation? That's the documentation?
Exactly.
Okay. Exactly.
To see how to, in other words, I've got an object. We're going to do a little example of a mail and a mail transport. That's what I'm going to use for our test-driven stuff. So if they want to know how to use this mail object and the mail transports, they'll go look for tests that support that. And they'll see how it's used, how it's set up, and etc. And that's an up-to-date, that's not stale, it has to be up-to-date because it's functioning code. So that's basically what that says. What you'll find if you also, a benefit is if you can get disciplined and adhere to test-driven development is greatly reduced debugging time. You'll find things quicker. The longer time goes between changing code and seeing and knowing you have a bug, the longer that time frame is, the harder it is to find it. Well, with this, you run tests and I'll know it seconds later, potentially. And therefore, I know where I just introduced it. I'll go fix it. And it will reduce that time tremendously. It's easier to maintain existing code because I'm changing code that I know is working. I've got tests. I can refactor this code or do something to it. And if my tests are broken, it's much easier to change code if you have that suite available to you. And it builds confidence in code, in both for developers and users, because the quality of the code always goes up. What's a good test look like? Number one is it runs very fast. You don't want your developers to push a button and wait, minutes and minutes and whatever for tests to run. They won't do it, is the bottom line. And then another thing that it separates out dependencies on things like the database and networks, the file systems, services. You might ask why. Well, it becomes really hard to keep tests functioning if you're pointing at a database for input, because I'll guarantee you somebody has changed data in that database. You've got a lot of prep work to get it back to a known state. So it's better to mock that data or to simulate that incoming data in some way so that you know what you're testing, it's not as slow as going to the database, etc. Now, I crossed out file system. I will do that. I try to avoid it somewhat, and the reason being is I may have a test that I'm going to put on a server and it doesn't have a C drive that's accessible to me or a D drive so you'd have to virtualize your paths because you want these things to run anywhere on any environment that you might run them on, and so you can get in trouble there. What I'll do sometimes is embed resources in my test code, and I'm using that as my input, but you want to try to stay away from, I'm tied to this, in our example, SMTP implementation on a mail server. We're gonna be able to mock that. Obviously, we have to write that at some point in time, but I'm going to be able to do a lot of my testing without having that in place. And a test is very limited in scope. In other words, I don't want it to test, the world. I want it to be a method. I'm testing this method, or just a little bit of stuff, because then it's easier to know what that test is, to understand that test. I don't want a developer going to understand this code to go and find this test that's like, it's cryptic and there's too much going on. I want them to see little bits of pieces of work. Runs in isolation. In other words, it doesn't need a lot of dependencies, as we talked about. Test A can run before test B or vice versa. It doesn't matter. They should all be able to run completely independently in isolation. A good test is, I'm going to treat it just like production code. I'm going to eliminate duplicate code. I'm going to use the solid principles as much as possible. I treat it as if it's valuable asset like production code, because it is. And it clearly reveals its intention. And I'll show you some things I do there to help in that intention. So how do you get started? My experience is start small. Don't try to do, some really complicated object that you're working on necessarily. Start with something simple. It's always easier to deal with something simple. Start on new code if possible. And I say that because people always ask, well, we've got this legacy system. What do I do about that? And I'll say, well, put tests in place, but it's always harder to test something that exists. And the reason being is oftentimes it's not set up to be testable. And what I mean by that, it may be doing too much stuff in one object. It may violate some of those principles. It may not be easily mocked. It may not, there's things you can do to make code better testable, but it's also making code better to do that. And so existing code oftentimes it doesn't fit that bill very well, and so it's harder to do. Try to hit 100% coverage. I don't know, you'll fall short, I promise. Don't worry about that, but it's a goal to shoot for. And I don't worry too much about getters and setters on properties. If that's all they're doing, it doesn't matter. But have a goal of, I want to test everything that I'm writing. It will feel strange at first. It will feel awkward. Keep trying is all I can do. Encourage you to try. And it's important, if you're doing this, if you're doing it for your job, to get your customers and your management to accept it. I was lucky at Intel 13 years ago. We brought Agile practices into Intel, and we had complete full buy-off from everybody. And it helped us to get through you'll be slow at first to get through some of that. But the benefits at the end of the process are tremendous for us. A little bit about legacy code. I've touched on this, but it's much harder to do than new code. And so the practice I did on existing code was I'd write tests that covered areas of that existing code that I'm changing. I'm not going to just go start writing tests because I'll get bogged down because I just hit an area that's hard to test. And I'm not changing that area anyway. So let me focus on the area I'm changing. And if that's hard to test, I'm going to redo code to make it easier to test. Work in small increments, as I mentioned before, and expect it to go slow at first, especially in the existing code world. And you'll probably find that existing code that needs to be refactored for testability, and just the way it is. And try to use a test-first approach on new features that you're adding to that code. Tips for success. Yeah, it's a skill that requires practice. Do it and keep doing it. And I'll guarantee there'll be frustrations. What I find that people give up on, it's because they hear, oh, I'm only supposed to do a little bit of code at a time. But what is that exactly? Is it one line? And there's uncertainties. Don't worry. Just do it. Just push. If you're writing more than you should, you'll figure it out, right? Don't let that stop you. Don't let that slow you down. And oftentimes people do. They'll hear that the purest way of doing it is this and that, and I'm having a hard time doing it. That's okay. Don't worry about that. Find your way you're comfortable with, because you're going to get benefit out of it from doing it. So what I want to do is kind of go through a test-driven type process that we might do for this email functionality. And I want to be able to validate that there's, a to address was provided or at one or more from the subjects there, those sorts of things. I want to add flexibility to the Microsoft available mailing stuff, because I want to support things other than like SMTP potentially. Intel has a secure mail layer, if you will. I want to be able to support that. I want to have some flexibility in that I want to support multiple transports and maybe all at once. In other words, we want to send email through SMTP ultimately, but it's often a requirement. I want to log that in what just happened. I want to log it to a database, or I'm going to treat that as a mail transport. It's not transporting it, to a mail server. It's transporting it someplace else. And so a good design will let us do that, and we'll make that happen in this test process. And it talks about doing that more than one at a time. So with that said, let's try to write some code. And hopefully I'm going to create a new Visual Studio project.
All right, we lost it on the
Nothing on the screen.
display,
Uh-oh.
but it's coming through on Windows P.
PowerPoint decided that you wanted to be extended.
Okay, we got it now, right?
All right, we're good.
Okay, I'm going to create a new project. I got to get my screen, and that's that one. Oh. And I just picked the wrong one, so bear with me a second here. What I just created there was a unit test project. I'm going to do that again because I want you to be able to see.
Change your theme from dark to light.
Yeah,
Can't
yeah.
see what- Change it back a little bit.
I got to remember where I find the theme.
You like the dark theme too, huh?
Yeah, I like the dark.
Not for presentations. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Have to increase font size too, but we'll see.
He can do that on the editor, but he can't do it on the whole screen, I don't think.
Yeah.
So,
No, on the editor is what I meant.
Here, I'll tell you what. I'll just. What I've done is I've created a test project here. Or I'm actually, like I said, I'm going to delete this. In fact, let me start over. Because I want to create, I want to try to make it as much as you're going to do it in the real world as possible. Okay, I'm going to create a brand new project, and we're going to create a mail library, basically. It's going to have our mail stuff in it. This is what would be our production code, and I'm just going to call that mail. And I'm actually going to, I'm not writing any production code yet. I'm going to get rid of that class. And then there's actually two, I'm going to add another project. This time I'm going to use the Microsoft test project. There's two frameworks that are popular. Microsoft's test, which is what this option is going to bring in the references for, and then one called NUnit. They have their pros and cons. This one's, easy to get going with, no downloads, no nothing, and so we'll just use that for now. I find NUnit faster in running tests, but other than that, they're pretty similar. So I'm going to call this
faster in running tests, but how significant is that?
If you have thousands of tests, you'll notice it. It makes a difference, right? So, and we have several thousand on some of the projects that I work with.
Right.
But that should be being done on TFS during build, and really people shouldn't be watching that.
Actually, the tests that I encourage you running tests all the time.
That, but not 1,000.
Yeah, absolutely.
You can run
absolutely.
Tests.
I'm going to run 1,000 tests every time.
Oh no.
And the reason I am is because I want to make sure I didn't break something.
I hear you, but
yeah.
Okay, so here's
from
the next
a manager's perspective, I don't want to hear that, because I want to hear that your fingers on the keyboard and you're running 1,000 tests when you're ready to run 1,000 tests, not all the time running 1,000 tests.
So
yeah.
The bottom line is, how long does it take to run 1,000 tests?
For me, if I've done the test properly, it'll take 10 seconds to run 1,000 tests. It's not the end of
my experience with it was not 10 seconds.
Yeah.
1,000 tests would have been a couple of minutes.
If there's an integration test, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit in this presentation, I don't know how far I'm going to get with where I am, but integration type tests, absolutely, I don't run those because they will take longer. And now what that means is I'm now wanting to test down to the database level a little bit, or that mail really went through the SMTP, mail server, those sorts of things. Those are integration tests. I'm integrating outside this little world here to other things like the database, like the network, like a file share someplace.
That's when you use Entity Framework to preload a known set of data into a test database and then run against the Entity Framework, or run against the database live, which is an integration test.
And I would consider that an integration test. Right. I'm not going to run that test here. Right. I'm going to run that test when I check in code, and the build server runs. I'm going to run that test. But all the others, and you can categorize them as these are integrations and these are not. I'm going to run everything that's not an integration test all the time on my code.
All right.
Okay. So I just added this. I called this mail fixture. And let's start writing some code, basically. I actually shouldn't have deleted that one, probably. And I'm going to call this class mail tests. All right, and
or left-hand corner of the edit window. Up, 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 up. Isn't that right there?
Oh, gotcha. More?
A little bit more. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Can you see that, old man?
Barely.
Okay.
Your glasses.
Are you guys?
The differences between Microsoft tests and like in-unit tests is really mostly in the attributes that you tag things with. And what I'm saying here is, this is a class that it contains tests, and that's in essence what I'm saying. I'm going to ask real quick, do any of you guys use ReSharper?
Oh, hell yes.
Okay, yeah, it's
Just stay home.
maybe I'm going to show you things here while I'm doing this because it will make your life so much better, even if you don't do test-driven development. But in this world, it's almost a must-have. What I've got here is a ReSharper setup code snippet that I've created that's going to help me write this test. You'll notice I tagged it with test method. And one of the things I mentioned was you wanted the purpose of your test to be known or to be documented or to be, and so what I like to do is say there's 3 parts to it. First of all, I'm going to test something called a send method. And my scenario is it's a complete mail message, and it should send. We'll talk about how to know that that happened, but that's what I want this test to be. And test first. It's a design process. That's what this is about. And so I'll be pairing with someone at Intel, for example, and we'll kind of start writing some code. Might look like this. I don't want to use the built-in thing here. We're doing our own thing here. I want to have an object, a mail message object. And I want to be able to say mail message send in some fashion. And I want to be able to check that that worked. So I want to be able to do something along those lines right there. You'll notice there's compiler problems. It's like, it won't work. So we're going to write some code to make it work. This is now production code. I'm not going to import that reference. So this is a ReSharper. I'm going to create a new class. And this is complaining because it needs a method. I'm going to add that method. I'm just going to write enough code to, I want every test to fail first. And that way I know when I'm adding code and doing code that I fixed it. I got it working, right? And so that's done. I'm going to go ahead and run this test, and you're going to see it's going to fail. And there's the red, it failed. Now I'm just going to write enough code. I realize this will seem a little strange. I'm going to make it pass right now. That's not very functional, exciting code, but I have some code now that does something, right? I have some production code that will actually does something. A couple problems here, though. If I'm looking at the solid principles and whatnot, it is natural to think about sending a mail message, but I don't want the mail message to be responsible for that sending of information. Because then now it becomes really hard for me to support those different transports that I'm talking about, because I have to have a lot of knowledge and stuff built into mail message. So what I'm going to prefer to do is I'm going to start out with one, debug mail transport. I'm going to treat this thing, and I'm going to pass this thing to this guy instead. That in our design work, we decided that seems like a reasonable way to approach this thing. So let's write some code to make all that happen. Okay, it's adding this down here. I'm going to go ahead and let it do that for now, and then I'm going to create this mail transport type. And I want this mail transport type to actually be responsible for the work, right? So he's going to have send, and what's he going to send? A mail message. I want him to fail. If I run this, I want this test to fail, right? That's kind of what I'm shooting for at this point in the game. And so you're going to see it work. And I'm going to say, what the heck? Why did it work? And I'll have to go dig and look. And I wired something in here that I'm not really using. So let's hook it up. I'm sorry? Oh, I got to resend. You're right. Thanks. My keyboard just kind of froze for a second there. Right? I'm going to let him do the send. And now I'm expecting this test to fail. I am making it work simply. I can make it succeed. I'm trying to speed up if I can and hopefully don't lose. So I have this thing that succeeds, still not doing a whole lot, right? But what we did just accomplish is separation of responsibilities in that the mail message is going to be responsible for his information, the transport is going to be responsible for sending messages. That's a good separation. In fact, this is a form of dependency injection. I can change the behavior of this by injecting a different transport into this. And a lot of times that discussion you'll get into inversion of control containers and blah, blah, blah. You can do dependency injection, and it's a good thing to do. It's the last solid principle without a container whatsoever. That's what we've basically accomplished by doing this.
I was thinking of that. Would you want to use an interface class?
Great guess. Absolutely. This is ugly, right? This is ugly. So a couple of interfaces that I think I want to introduce, and I'll do it now that you've asked that question, is I don't want send here always take this. That's coupled it to this, right? I don't want that. I want to decouple it. So let's introduce something called mail transport. It's an interface. And what is this interface going to do? It's going to do one thing, send. And right now it's a mail message, but let's decouple that also. I'm working some code here. Obviously I need this interface. Let ReSharper create that. And right now it's just I won't have anything on it quite yet. We'll change that. And so I want this transport should be a mail transport. And he's complaining about something. I got something wrong in this signature. Oh no, what it wants is, I haven't changed this yet, right? So I'm going to do that. And I'll get rid of this duplicate one. All right. And I have one more problem here. I'm sending this, but all right, we changed this to be an iMessage. Our iMail message. Let's go ahead and introduce that, get everything back. Now we just refactored some code and we had a successful test. I want to make sure I still work, and I do. So I know that my refactoring to introduce the interfaces and stuff, I didn't break anything, right? That's a pretty nice thing to be able to know. Now, I still don't have the functionality that I need. It's kind of it's like, oop, mailing it, it's returning true. So to mock this, to make this so that I have a better way of knowing that the transport received this message, what I'm going to do, this is kind of an interesting concept, but I'm going to actually make this transport also look like a mail message. And the reason I want to do that is I want to be able to set properties and stuff on it here's what I want to do. I want to do my test. I want to be able to say mail message dot from is equal to john.doe@gmail.com. I want that sort of thing on my mail message, right? So let's go ahead and add that. We're adding it down here to the mail message. It's also part of the interface that I want. So let's find our interface and add it. And I don't need the public on it. All right, so I've just added something to this interface. That's going to let me build up a message that's kind of meaningful. And this is complaining to me now because I want this to look like both a transport and a mail message. And I've changed the interface, so let's add that there. And what this is going to let me do now is basically assert that my mail message.from is equal to my mail transport.from. In other words, the transport got it. I have a way now of seeing in my ultimate final SMTP transport isn't going to look like a mail message. But this gives me a way of testing it to say the transport got it, and once he's got it, he should be able to do his thing with it. Now, there would be some tests in that space. I would want to separate out some objects that are testable once he gets converting it from my mail message to a Microsoft one. But this is going to let me know transport got it, and that's good enough for my test right now. So if I do this and run it, what's going to happen? It failed. And why did it fail? It failed because I put this assertion in here, and this is what I wanted to happen, and these two guys weren't equal. And the reason they weren't equal is I didn't. Here I'm in the transport, and I want to say, did it get to the transport? And I'll run the test again, and it works. So I'm getting closer to where I want to be. I've got this transport that's helping me test and know things are there. I've got a debug transport in place. What I would continue to do here is add properties. I'd add the to, the from, and in fact, let me do one more. I'm going to add a subject. I'm not going to do them all just for the sake of time. Okay, I'm going to add that, and of course it's complaining. My ultimate goal here is I want to be able to do this, are equal the mail message subject and the mail transport subject, which aren't there yet. We're going to make them be there. Okay, adding it here. This is to the mail object. I want to add it to the interface. Now, and one thing I will say is the way this is flowing, every test, don't worry if you violate one little, I wrote too much code or whatever. Get in your own flow. Every time you do, if I did this again in an hour or tomorrow, they would flow a little bit differently. It doesn't matter. The end result is you have a suite of tests and you have a design that's flexible enough to be tested, and that's the important thing. So I'm going to run this test again. I just introduced another property. Of course, it's going to fail, right? So we're going to go fix that failure. It failed because it didn't get to the transport. I want to be able to know that it did. So subject is equal to mail message.subject, and run it again. And it's going to pass. It's going to be successful. So I have now built a mail message object with not all the properties. We would keep adding them, but I know that they're capable of getting to this generic thing called an iMail transport because I can test that that's happening, and that's a good thing. One of the other requirements, I'm going to move on here, was to have the send message, do a complete message to multiple transports. I expect it to all transports received data. All right, that's what we want to come up with, is that kind of a test. All right, my gut would be right here to copy a lot of this because that's a success or a complete message and blah blah blah, but that would be duplicating a lot of code. So what I'm going to do is let ReSharper help me, and I'm going to create a method called create complete message. Remember, we want to treat this test code as production code, right? And so I'm going to do this same thing in my next test, at least create that complete message. Now, a difference is that I'm going to create some different transport, so we'll kind of hang on that, and I'm going to send it to that transport. But this part of the test, I'm going to do for my new transport too, and I want everything in it to face this scrutiny. So I'm going to say validate mail transported successfully, something like that. I'm going to introduce that as well, and we'll see where and I changed some code, so I'm actually going to run and make sure I haven't really messed myself up and be chasing my tail on my next steps, and I'm still good to go. So what we wanted to do here was create a composite mail transport. I'm going to call it composite transport. And I want to add to it. It's a composite. It means that I can give it more than one. It's a list of things. Well, I'm just going to give it 2 of these. I already have these in my tool chest. So I'm going to add a couple of those, and it's kind of complaining because it doesn't know about it. Well, let's fix that piece of the code. I want this thing to be a list of iMail transports, and I also want it to act like a transport. You see why the interfaces are extremely valuable and give you a better flexible design. All right. Now what do I want to do in this send? I've got multiple ones that I want to get this. I'm going to do code here for just a second that I wouldn't normally do. And I'm going to have ReSharper help me with it in a second. Mail transport. And basically what I'm going to do is say mail transport.send mail message. And I want to say if it fails, return false. And what I want to do here is I want this to fail, as we've seen before. So I'm going to return false here too. This guy's doomed to fail, right? That's actually what I want. But let me grab this. I'm a little bit lazy. I probably shouldn't do that. I'm kind of rushing for time because it's so easy, to introduce problems by simple cutting and pasting of things. Right? There's that. If I run this, it failed, and it failed because it wasn't true. I'm going to fix that. But the thing is I fixed it, so I know that, but I'm not asserting that all my transports are working, right? I want to do this type of validation right here, that this worked. But in order to do that, I'm going to change a few things here and make sure this works. Mail message. because I'm really testing. I want it to be a mail message, right? In other words, when I'm actually, that transport I have, it looks like a mail message, and that's what did it get there? Did it validate? Right? And so I've changed some code. Let me, okay, being a good test-driven person, I want to run it again, make sure I didn't break the fact that that interface is still useful and workable. And I'm going to grab this. Now in this test, for each thing in this guy here, I want to run that method. So for each in composite mail transport of type iMail message, I want to do, I'm going to call this a transport because that's kind of what it looks like from this place. And then I'm going to call this with message and mail transport. And my broken test from before, actually I got it working. This should, my reworking should actually still work, and it does. I've got some code though that I'm a little, I mentioned I wouldn't typically do this, and so I'm going to refactor it. I'm going to let ReSharper refactor it. That's much better in my feeling, so let's make sure that works. And they're so fast, all my tests are still succeeding. Life is good. So we now have something that supports multiple transports.
Can you prove to me your test isn't succeeding because you have that true?
Yeah, you want me to?
Yeah.
That'll fail it, right?
In theory, it should.
Mm-hmm. Are you confident now?
I'm more confident, yes.
Good. And that's a great thing. I mean, if ever you doubt, fail it. Make it, earn your confidence back by all means. I want to do something just kind of as a little exercise and fun. Console debug transport. We're going to add a third transport to this thing that doesn't exist. I want it to behave just like a debug transport, like that. I want to override this thing though. So public Boolean. I want to override. It's going to complain. Send iMail message. Mail message. And what I want to do here is just console. Sometimes ReSharper helps you too much. From mail message. Subject to something else we can look at. All right, and then I'm going to pass it off to the base class. Return base send mail message. I'm just kind of interjecting in here through inheritance. Displaying something. I don't normally do this, but it'll give us something to look at here. And let ReSharper make the other virtual. So now if I run this test, I'm going to just run that one. You'll see that all three got it, and this one actually displayed a little bit of information on the screen. So kind of excitement there. Ooh. One last thing that to show you before I wrap this up with, because if you're noticing, I'm letting ReSharper put methods and stuff in this test. In fact, it's all in this file, right? It's not where it needs to live ultimately, but ReSharper facilitates doing that, and it's great because it's fast, but it also helps me move it back up to this assembly where it's going to live ultimately, and I'll show you that, because obviously you want to do that, and then you want to make sure your tests are still running. But one last requirement that we had, and I'm just going to throw in a test here, is test send with missing from address throws missing from address exception. I just want to give you another feel for another type of thing. I want this guy to, I'm expecting an exception. And so there's a tag for that type of missing from address. All right, and ReSharper's telling me that doesn't exist. So let's add it. It is an exception. All right, and I'm going to go run that test. There's nothing in it here, but you'll see it's going to fail because it's not going to throw that exception. And so what I'm going to do here is just do a new mail message dot send new debug transport. I don't have to do anything fancy. I'm not setting any properties. I'm not doing anything. I'm expecting this to throw an exception ultimately because there's no from address. Let me run it, and it still failed. Okay, I got to fix that. That's a problem. So what I'm going to do here is say we'll run that test again, run them all, and it succeeded. It did throw that. Let me use this as an opportunity, though, to we wanted to validate a couple things, so let's go ahead and do that. With missing subject throws missing subject exception. Right? I'm actually going to do this a little differently because and I would normally come to this through the testing process. This is a complete message. I'm going to truncate it or invalidate it based off what the test wants, like that, and then do mail message.send. All right, I'm going to duplicate some stuff. Again, be careful of this. It's time. I'm trying to save subject because it introduces problems always. All right, I want this to throw expected exception is type of missing subject exception. Right, we'll add it. An exception also. And if I run, what's going to happen? It's going to fail, right? Because I'm just not really doing that work yet. So let's go make it do that, and then I'll show. Then there'll be a refactoring opportunity here. This is from subject. This is missing subject exception. Now I'll run it, and it should succeed. All right, I have good tests. It's doing some validation. It's doing some things, but this gives me a little bit of heartburn. I I want to refactor this. And one of the things I want to do is I want to put it into its own validate message. But I also kind of want to change how that works. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say validate. I don't want it to be message. I'm going to introduce a new thing. So I'm refactoring code here, and I'm doing it confidently because I've got tests up there to cover this change that I'm making. I wanted to do that, and the thing I'm validating here is from. So let's add this method. And this will be an item. And how do I want to deal with this? I want to say if string.is null or empty item, then I'm going to throw an exception using an activator dot create type of t dot. All right, I can get rid of this. I can do the same thing here. Validate with this. And subject, get rid of this. Now again, I'm undergoing refactoring. I've made a fair amount of change, but that's what tests are for. Just let me refactor and know I didn't break anything. So my next step would be, I need my real SMT one, TP transport, right? I've got a way of testing. I need a real one. That's going to be an integration test, and we don't obviously have time to create that. But I'm going to create one, and it's going to support that interface. It's going to fit this flexibility. I would probably then create one that logs to a database because that was one of the requirements. And that's an integration test because it's going to take more time to make that happen. Maybe I want one that writes to a file on what it did. I can create that and make that all happen because I have created a flexible mail framework with a mail message and some transports that can take any kind of transports that we want. That's all pretty valuable stuff. And it came through the design work through this interface. But I'm not going to do those things, but before I wrap up here, what I do want to do is show you, like I mentioned before, there's a lot of stuff in this one file, and that's not a good place to be. ReSharper will help me here. I'm going to tell it to move this interface, and I want to move it to, I'm not a salesman for ReSharper, but I couldn't honestly live without it. I'm going to move it to mail, and I'm also going to move any of these guys down here that belong in that. This exception belongs there. This exception belongs there. This console one is really for testing purposes. Doesn't go there. This one will go there. That's a testing one, helping me mock, and that one will go there. I'm going to say this. Now what it's complaining about is, I'll show you. I'm just going to let it do it, but I know what it's complaining about. It's saying that I've moved it and there's no reference here anymore. So let me add that reference.
I was wondering if, so ReSharper doesn't set the reference then?
It warned me that it was not going to work. And normally I would have kind of caught that earlier in the game. Let me build this. Okay, did I not click on it?
I think you added the reference.
Yeah, it's right there. Oh, here we go. It needed to add it as a using clause here. And so ReSharper did that part of it for me, right? But, so I still have a few more in here that I want to move out. This guy, I don't want to be in this file. I want to move him into his own file in the same place, the same namespace or assembly. So I'll do that. And there's this debug one. I'll do that. And the rest of that stuff looks like it's just tests. So I'm going to compile it, and I'm going to run my tests again. Make sure I didn't mess anything up. And they're all running. So I have code now living where it should live. I've got all that. Now, could I have written that code faster just plowing my way through it? Probably, but I'll guarantee you in a month or so, when you're doing other things and change it, it pays for itself. It absolutely does. The project I work on at Intel it runs worldwide, and it's got major pieces to it with some pretty wild functionality, complicated algorithms, and we have thousands of tests, and it's the most robust piece of software they run out there because we have invested in the tests. And I know when I change something, I didn't break anything. In fact, what we do, we use Agile methodologies, continuous integration. So when I check in this code and my build server runs, it runs all the tests. And as soon as that happens, I know, oh, my tests were working, but I broke something integration-wise or whatever. I got to go fix that thing right now. So those will run hundreds of times before my next release. So I know I'm very highly confident when it goes to production. It's good because I'm protected by continuous integration and lots of tests. So anyway, hopefully you see some value. If nothing else, maybe Resharper. I sold you on Resharper. But if you can practice up and do it and stick with it, it's hugely valuable, hugely valuable. Anyway, any questions?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to be impolite here and say that I know you started programming before test-driven development came along.
Absolutely.
Because I did too. How did you make that transition?
It's a good question. Intel made a concerted effort to adopt Agile practices, and that's Beck and Martin and the guys from the Agile world, the Gang of Four, that's who came up with test-driven development. So it's one of the pillars of Agile. And so we sort of embraced it. I'll be honest, there's still groups that don't do it, but we had to. We saw the benefit of it and just stayed with it. So it took management support, because we had to let them know, we're going to slow down a little bit here at first, right? It's going to take some time to get this under our belt. So it took management support, and it took practice and sticking to it, basically. But I've seen the value. I can't tell you, and I know we've all experienced it, that innocuous change, it's not going to hurt anything. And it's like, wow, I'd never in a million years thought that would hurt anything, and it did. Where I don't see that anymore. I just don't see it happen anymore at all. Or you've also probably seen, and I try not to copy and paste because it can introduce insidious things, but you'll see where that introduces a problem that you don't catch. And so in the long run, it really, I'm faster doing it this way because I'm not spending debugging time anymore. I'm finding debugging time is so greatly reduced because I see it so much more quickly that I'm able to be working on tests and production code much more often. But long-winded answer.
Okay, I want to go back to one of the early ones is adding, unit testing basically to
That's
code.
Right. Mm-hmm.
How do you do that?
Yeah. Much more difficult. Much more difficult. So if you're wanting to learn and just fall in love with this, that's a hard place to fall in love with it. But what I found to be the most successful thing in doing it is if I'm touching that code someplace, I'm adding some functionality, then I'm going to first try to put tests in place for the existing functionality. In other words, I'm going to try not to change that functionality. I just want to know that I've got some tests that give me confidence it's doing what I think it's doing. Right? I'll do that first. Sometimes that is extremely hard to do. And the reason it will be, the most common difficulty in that is you're testing, say, a mail object like this, let's say, but buried inside it is transport functionality. Now it becomes a hard thing to test, right? Because it's embedded in there, and so you get frustrated with that. What I'll do, though, is I'll start to refactor that to something better so that it is testable because I'm getting benefit. But you can see just by me describing it, it's a harder place to learn to do it.
So it's breaking the single functionality principle.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's something that, sorry,
Go ahead.
even without test-driven development, that should happen anyway, right? I mean, you really should be designing to those principles, but putting this in place helps you to get there, but also helps you to know that you did it successfully, basically.
The way I look at it, when you get to that first that method, the first thing you look at is this a good method?
Yeah.
If it's not, regardless of whether you're doing test-driven development or regular old development, you need to start looking at refactoring, because if you start monkeying with bad code, you are going to end up with more bad code.
Right.
So if you don't go ahead and take that look and go, yeah, this is not a good principled method, and start refactoring it anyway, whether you're doing TDD or not,
yeah,
then you're asking, you're just going to introduce another bug or a different bug or the same bug in a different way. So always go at it and look at it, and say, is this a good method?
Yeah.
From a management standpoint, I'd also caution you to make sure that you're not in your head going, I didn't write this, therefore it's not a good method. That's one of my big, how do you got to look at that method and go, is it a good method, right? Not, did I write this method, or is it formatted the way I would format this method, or all of these other things. But the idea of what you were saying about legacy code is going back and saying, I'm going to go in and I'm going to write tests on all of my legacy code.
Yeah.
Good luck on getting your boss to go, absolutely, you know what, just take a year off.
Yeah.
Don't create a new project for us. Don't help us make more profit.
Yeah.
Go back and solve all the things that you didn't solve the first time you wrote the code,
Right.
because we're all behind you,
Yeah.
right? That's not going to happen, right?
Yeah.
So the trick is to get your boss and get everybody to understand that when you make a change, there's going to be an additional amount of time, because you are going to look at the code, you're going to refactor, you're going to start writing tests, and in time, right, you will get code coverage.
Right.
Or you won't need to put code coverage on it, because that stuff's working, and if it's working, great. You don't need to go slap a test on it right now if it's working.
So that's an important point then. So you don't need to cover all of it. If you're making changes in module A, then maybe work on tests for module A and B.
Correct.
B, C through Z.
If you want to give up in completely exasperated in test-driven development, try to write tests for a complete existing application. It won't happen. It will not happen. I guarantee it. So exactly right. If you're touching some area, or if you're adding new functionality, great, do it. It's new. If you're touching something existing, then put tests in place. But don't go doing it everywhere else. And your point, I love that point, because I have seen developers that can't seem to read code unless it's code they wrote. Right, and so their tendency is to, in order to understand it, I'm going to change it. Yeah, it's that's somebody else's problem at that point, right? Yeah. Because the reality is, if you can't read somebody else's code, where are you to me? In the long run. Exactly. Right? If you can't refactor a piece of code, where are you to me in the long run? Yeah.
It's always somebody else's code.
Especially
in today's world.
And as I teach my students, it's always somebody else's code, and you should assume that somebody else is an axe murderer who knows where you live.
Yeah.
Right? Because you need to write code that they're going to be able to read.
Yeah.
Because they're the ones that, right? We all read somebody else's code, and if you can't read code or debug it or step through it or whatever, which you shouldn't have to get into the step through to be going, oh, well, how does this code work? I'm going to have to step through it. Well, okay, refactor. But always look at it from, does this work, right? And if it works, let's not go break it. Now, you want to clean it up, it's a little long. There's some quick and easy places where you can, extract methods.
Resharper.
Right. But honestly, for the most part, with the exception of though I haven't tried moving things to a new file, everything else that you did Visual Studio 2015 does. Right. So control period will do most everything because that's how I teach too. I say you write the bad class, and then you say, create me a new class, right? You write the bad method, and then you say, create me the method, and you just, that's how I teach people to write code without using ReSharper as well.
Not to say against sell ReSharper, but there are other, like, you want to see what, I want to see if I can find a method. Let's see. This is a crummy example, but let me find it. I moved it over here, so let me just go there. You want to see what that looks like, what that implementation is? Then there it is. Basically, it will reverse engineer any code that you have in your application, and you can go, and sometimes that's hugely valuable to be able to go see, well, what's going on here. It's another thing that ReSharper is hugely valuable at. It's a time saver if you spend the time to learn. Yeah.
I'm sold.
I got a question for you guys that have been using ReSharper.
I'm sorry?
I got a question for you.
Uh-huh.
Using ReSharper. I've got a problem in Razor views right now, where ReSharper is giving me whole each about things like app model, and saying, "Oh, I can't find this anywhere." And the same code on a different machine that's not running ReSharper is absolutely happy.
So yeah, it's a couple of things. There's a file, and I don't remember what it's called. And actually, in the new version, they don't store it in the same place as. But you can delete it. It's a cached information because sometimes that gets messed up. Delete it.
Does it help if you clean?
No, because it's not stored in any place that it's going to clean.
It's not part of the application. It's part of ReSharper.
Right. So that's one thing is delete that file. Find out with your version where that file is and delete it. And then.
Yeah, but I haven't learned the right language yet for that particular problem.
Yeah.
So if you don't know
Look, if your Google foo is lacking.
Yeah, I am not on top of it.
Yeah.
But that gives me an idea.
Yeah. Anyway, that's hopefully you got a feel for test driven. It will be awkward, but there's definitely value in it. But keep in mind what management and customer, I mean, it's balance. You can never be successful if you're making a manager unhappy or if you're making a customer unhappy. But my experience has been they both can be made happy if they get on board and then see that I'm releasing solid code all the time because of it.
So my next question along those same lines is, how long do you think it took before you became comfortable with the whole TDD process?
Honestly, it probably of sticking with it, and I'm here 8 hours a day, solid in front of this thing. It probably took several months of sticking with it to do it, to feel more comfortable. And again, don't let there are people who will say, well, you're writing too much code. You're supposed to just do a little bit at a time. Do what's comfortable for you. And there'll be times when I need to go write a little bit of production code to just sort of experiment with this concept. And I haven't written a test yet. That's okay in my view. I'm not a purist. Because I find nobody can stick to that purist approach. That's my feeling on it. But it took a couple months of sticking with it and seeing the benefit. Jamie knows Ken Munslinger. He's a person that was a contractor out at Intel. He had never done it before. By the time he left our project, he's an evangelist because he sees now, oh my gosh, it saves me so much time, and I can the best feeling of all is they want a new feature or I have to change something. I can refactor, with so much more confidence because I know if I broke it or not. And that's a good feeling to have. Anyway, that's test-driven development.